Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first session of the Avant-Garde Today, the question of autonomy, taught by J.P. Caron. The seminar brings together two understandings of the problem of the avant-garde in art. The no-classic approach offered by Peter Bürger in his seminal book, Theory of the Avant-Garde, and Harry Lehmann essay, Avant-Garde Today. The seminar hypothesized that the two understandings illustrate different models of progress in and against art's autonomy that will be worked with through the 4 sessions. In doing so, it hopes to question the many connections that bring together art, the hypothesis of its autonomy, and its political affordances. Bürger understands the avant-gardist impulse not as a new style with the institution of art, but as an attempt to break with art altogether, scattering aesthetic effects upon life at large. He offers one of the clearest understanding of the avant-garde, based on art reaching out of its own definition, progressively absorbing that which is not art into that which is art, while the historical avant-garde is seen by Bürger as a final breaking point, given that art is individualized as an autonomous sphere. This same notion is taken by Lehmann to offer a model of aesthetic modernity predicated on the autonomization of the elements that compose art. Instead of reading the avant-garde as an impulse to the outside, Lehmann sees it as a new coupling between the work, the medium, and the reflection itself, complementing these two models of the avant-garde. This seminar will also tackle the theoretical basis the two authors are polemizing against. Adorno aesthetic theory, a model that Bürger takes to be intrinsically anti-avant-gardist, and Lehmann tries to supersede with his understanding. Finally, in the last session, you see a more recent synthetic approach by Metin on his book Social Dissonance. Metin offers a contemporary model for art reaching out of its limits towards politics, but coinciding with a change in the materials of art making. Now, instead of aesthetic appearance, as Adorno would have it, the social world appears to constrain art. Jean-Pierre is a philosopher in music and musician based in Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo. He is lecturer at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro and an instructor at the New Center for Research and Practice. As a musician, he released many albums, several through his own label Seminal Records. He's currently writing 2 books on the relationships between language and rule following, forms of life and value form in contemporary capitalism, on the ontology of indeterminacy in experimental music from an inferentialist point of view. JP?
Hey, thank you, Clarice. Yeah, I think the abstract is quite thorough, I think. But yeah, I'll start from to like give again a kind of an outline of what I want to do here. It's already in my PowerPoint, so I'll just start right away to share it. I think you got the syllables and you got also a certain division of can you see that? Yeah, can you see that?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Presentation here. Okay. So I think you got the syllables. There's like a division between. This is something that we'll have to fine tune with Clarice. There's a division between text for presentation and text that I'll be dealing with in class, but they are also open for presentations if anybody wants to present one of the, Bürger's chapters or Adorno or whatever. They are also up for presentations. The difference is that texts for presentation are only for presentation. I don't guarantee that I'll be able to tackle all of them in detail in class because time is limited, as you know. So this is why I didn't put any one text specifically for presentation for today. Because usually you take like you make an inscription for presented text presenting a text afterward, after the second session onward, usually. So with that in mind, I also kind of rearranged a little bit what I'll be presenting in class and what will be the text for presentation for from students. But well, let us first get down to this thematic presentation of what is the seminar about. So the seminar is called Avant-Garde Today, as you know. I'll be basically the centerpiece of it is the reading of Theory of the Avant-Garde by Peter Bürger, and a comparison between that and Harry Lehmann's approach in the paper Avant-Garde Today. My first title was actually Theory of the Avant-Garde Today, which is a synthesis, but it became too long. So and of course, there is like a background, and the background are basically Adornian questions or questions that have to do with the way Western Marxism was dealing with the problem of the avant-garde or modernity, actually, modernism more specifically, and the avant-garde, which are two very different things that we will get clear about in this seminar, particularly in the second session on that will deal mostly on Adorno. First session is today, like the question of the avant-garde, which basically will be a reading of the first two chapters of Bürger. I included a little bit of the third chapter, and I skipped the section on Benjamin. Benjamin will be dealing with, in the second session, as a contrast to Adorno's conception of the artwork as a like monadic whole, as something that has a strong boundary against the social reality as a whole. So and this strong boundary is also like leading kind of theme or kind of a lifeline in this in the seminar, and it will be made explicit by the fourth section. So in the first session, there is a question of the avant-garde. We'll be reading Bürger today. The status of critical theory is the beginning. Like he has like a very kind of well thought out line of argumentation that I just want to today like very humbly to reconstruct, nothing too original today. We'll be talking about the status of critical theory, the relationship of theory to its history. So what does it mean to historicize theory is one of the themes of Bürger here. The relationship of the object to its history. So if you were talking about art, what is the relationship of art to its own history? And then the relationship of theory to its object. So once we historicize theory and we historicize the object, what is the kind of cognitive relation that obtains between theory and its object once they are both historicized, they are both rendered in a kind of in a relation to its historical moment. And this is a huge part of what Bürger is talking about here, and it's kind of the background of the argument about the avant-garde as the self-criticism of art itself, or what he calls an art institution. So this will be the program for today, basically, to reconstruct this movement of thought. And the next session we'll be talking about the question of the artwork. So this is important. If the avant-garde is the self-criticism of art, and if it's criticizing also the work or artwork form in a certain sense, right? So one of the components of this self-criticism is supposed to be also the dissolution of this art institution and the reinscribing of art practices, so-called art practices, in the practice of life itself. And it's very interesting. By the end of the section, we'll get to how this is done according to Bürger, which is quite interesting. It has to do with the dissolution between production and reception that is operated through the avant-garde. One important caveat is that he's talking about the historical avant-garde, not the neo-avant-garde. We'll get to the neo-avant-garde once we get like to the third session, right? Here is basically the historical avant-garde and its relationship to artistic modernism. So in the question of the artwork, like the second session, we'll talk about this, modernism against the avant-garde. Basically, Adorno is a modernist, but he's an anti-avant-gardist. One of the texts that I included is an essay by Bürger that is called precisely The Anti-Avant-Gardism of Adorno. I replaced this text, I mean, in my presentation for a more thorough presentation of the chapter 3 that was not included. So my new outline, I'll send that to you today after class. It's not too different, it's just very subtle differences. But in my new outline, we'll be reading the whole of theory of the avant-garde. So I think it's more interesting in that way. But Adorno's anti-avant-gardism is a text representation now for the second session. So it's open if anybody wants to get into that. So modernism against the avant-garde, the distance between artwork and society, which is like, why is it that Adorno defends the autonomy, the aesthetics of autonomy, which means not only autonomy of art practice, but the autonomy of the artwork. Therefore, he defends the existence or the maintenance of a certain form of boundary between artwork and society, even if the materials of the artwork would be like the social historical sediments of the historical unfolding of the bourgeois society, right? But there is functionally the necessity of a boundary that will basically keep the identity of the artwork against being absorbed by social reality at large. So actually the criticality of the work is also predicated on this autonomy of the artwork, which goes against the grain of the avant-garde as proposed by Bürger, basically. So the critique performed by artworks then is also a subject for this second session next week, okay? Third session, we get to the contemporary stuff, avant-garde today, the model that Lehmann is proposing, which is an alternative model of the avant-garde after postmodernism. Therefore, we are not necessarily here talking only about the historical avant-garde. His concept of the avant-garde in that paper basically includes the neo-avant-garde, what happened after the Fluxus, John Cage, and all of that. And that offers also a different model that maybe has to do with the fact that is an expanded concept of the avant-garde. It's not just the historical avant-garde of the 10s and 20s, 1910s and 1920s, but also the neo avant-garde from the 60s and 70s, which means what Bürger thought was the dream, the avant-gardist dream of destroying the boundary between art making, the art institution, and life itself. Like arguably, there wasn't any kind of naivete in that sense in the 60s and 70s. I mean, the gesture was there, but maybe its products were already absorbed by the art world and all that. So I think Lehmann is coming up maybe under the influence of that historical moment with a different model of what the avant-garde is. Instead of reaching to its outside, it's like the art practice reaching to an outside that is understood as social practices at large, or life itself, so to speak. It's a model of functional differentiation within the artwork. So he has like 3 different components of an artwork, and these 3 different components might have like complete or relative autonomy. And basically, it is, instead of an opening to its outside, it's an opening to the inside of the functioning of the different elements that compose traditionally an artwork. So this is the alternative model. One is outward, the historical one. The one that Bürger puts forward is, even if he has with Lehmann a bunch of commonalities that has to do with the kind of systems view of society in a certain sense. There's this emphasis on a functional differentiation that opens the work to its inner workings in terms of the components of a model of an artwork. And then the status of the artwork after the avant-garde and the neo avant-garde. Of course, this is what I was talking about. So in a certain sense, it's a theory for a different historical moment, but it's also an alternative view of what is the purchase of the historical avant-garde too. And then session 4, I'm calling it now on engagement of the boundary, because if the problem of the avant-garde has to do with the problem of social engagement or political kind of action, and this brought us to the question of the function of the artwork, if they are the function of autonomy, in a certain sense, if autonomy is that which will make a work critical or not, if the autonomy is something to be gotten rid of, uh, in order to actually have like a political action that is aesthetically oriented, as the avant-garde might want it. So here, like, we're making explicit this difference, and we're engaging Matin's work. He wrote this book a couple of years back called Social Dissonance, and I wrote a paper on that was published in December, which is called Convex Portrait in a Self-Mirror, about this book. And in it, like, I'm polemizing about this, what is the art practice that is being proposed in the book, and if this art practice, in a certain sense, falls into the first or the second concept of the avant-garde practice, of the relationship to its outside. Therefore, everything hinges on a certain relationship to the boundary. What is the relationship, what kind of boundary there is between a certain art practice that is not anymore the creation of artworks, and it's outside, and what kind of political purchase we might get from that kind of boundary and that kind of relation. So this would be the fourth session. Okay. So here is like just what I said. We'll be reading the chapter 1 and 2 and part of chapter 3 today. We're skipping the discussion of Benjamin that is in the end of chapter 2 for session 2. So in session 2, we're dealing with Adorno's aesthetic theory, the little extracts that I provided, that I suggested you read for class, and Bürger's chapter 3 with the discussion on Benjamin on chapter 2. Then in session 3, Lehmann's Avant-Garde Today and Bürger's chapter 4, and session 4, the social dissonance text and my text. And I'm leaving chapter 5 of Bürger's for presentations. So this was a little bit of rearranging of the reading materials for this seminar, keeping with what I'm actually doing in preparing the classes. Okay. So here I would just start presenting what Bürger is trying to do. And he's, of course, there's like this reference to Horkheimer. Like, I put also the Horkheimer text for the next session, if anybody wants to present on that text. But anyway, he's kind of jamming a little bit out of what Horkheimer was talking about in the comparison between traditional and critical theory. So I'll just start reading the extracts and explaining and trying to reconstruct the movement of thought that Bürger is putting forward here. But before I do that, any questions until now? Like, of course, I already gave like an overview, and there are kind of the basic thesis of the seminar are in this overview. Of course, we don't have the specifics, but if anybody already right from the start want to put out a question, and maybe some question for us to be thinking, and maybe at some point, I don't even have to answer right now the question that you might have, but it's just questions sometimes orient the way that we are dealing with the subject. So it's kind of, sometimes it's useful to have them right away. If anybody have one of those, or any clarifying questions too. Is Keke? Yep.
Yes, hello. I just wanted to find out, after the presentations, are we also gonna have to have like a final essay?
Yeah, this is the way usually the new center works. Like, part of the kind of grading system is attendance, and other part is presentation, and the third part is final essays. So basically, yes, usually you'll have to give a final essay at some point. But the final essay, it's basically, usually I fix it on 10 pages at most, about any kind of issue that is related to any aspect of the seminar. I leave it very open because people have also very different projects coming in, and maybe they'll have to, they want to kind of, they will need the leeway space be able to relate what they're doing, their personal work with the subject of the seminar at large. So basically, this is the way I do it. Does that answer?
Thank you. Yeah,
Okay.
thank you.
Anyone else? Okay. It's very early, I know. Okay, traditional critical theory then. So critical science differs from traditional science because it reflects the social significance of its activity. So sounds obvious, but it's not. So he spends a good deal of time trying to understand what does it mean to do like critical science instead of traditional science, like from afar the object, while critical science would understand it as part of what it's studying. Because if every and any object is a historical object of critical science, then the science itself is a historical object, which means like what is thinkable within the horizon that we are trying to think in relation to a given object. So it's a very synthetic kind of way of putting the problem, but as you see, it has a kind of interweaving already complexity to the question. So this is what I was saying in the beginning, like the relationship between theory and its history on one side, the relation between the object and its history on the other side, and the relation between the theory and the object. This is kind of the movement, the way I reconstruct the movement, the argumentative movement here. So he continues, critical science understands itself as part of social praxis, however mediated it may be. It is not disinterested, but guided by interest. In a first approximation, that interest may be defined as an interest in reasonable conditions in a world without exploitation and unnecessary repression. This interest cannot express itself directly in literary scholarship. So this is a very important topic, like in the sense of, is critical science oriented in a certain sense? And in what sense can it be oriented? Critical science, to be critical, is not only to, one way of putting it would be to say that it's critical because it reflects upon the historical limits that wherein it is enclosed. But it's not only that. In order to reflect on these historical limits, it must have a certain orientation. Otherwise, the historical limits wouldn't even appear. So in a sense, I think there's a strong kind of identity here between being reflective of its own historicity and having a certain interest that may be an ethical, political, moral interest in a certain sense. So this is, at least this is how I understand what Bürger is saying. So he offers this very minimal, may be defined interest, may be defined as an interest in reasonable conditions in a world without exploitation and unnecessary repression. So this is a very kind of difficult topic in Marxism in general, whether Marxism has a normative ideal or not, whether Marxism has is guided by ethical ideal or not, if the scientificity of Marxism is predicated upon disinterest or pure science, its scientificity, or if its scientificity in a certain sense comes from a certain form of interest. Like Bürger is clearly saying that there is an interest embedded in the way the literary scholarship is done, but it's not, this scholarship is not expressing directly this interest. Otherwise, it will be just, a matter of opinions or of direct moral discussion. So how is it that this interest may be reflected in the form this scholarship is carried on? Like, this is a good way maybe to put the question that he's aiming at. So then critical science does not consist in inventing new categories. This is very important too. Critical science does not consist in inventing new categories to then set them against the false ones of traditional science. Rather, it examines the categories of traditional science to discover what questions they permit one to ask and what other questions are already excluded at the theoretical level, precisely as a consequence of the choice of categories. Here, we must just reflect a little bit to see how this ethical predicament impinges upon what is thinkable within a certain horizon. if the categories we use to understand an object is completely subsumed under a given historical horizon, there's no way to criticize this historical horizon itself. There's no way to criticize the present. We could criticize the past from the point of view of the present, but not the present itself, in a certain sense. So this is why there is like a certain appeal to this politicized interest in the way one carries on critical science. But then there's a second problem. The first one would be that the necessity of this interest, this interested kind of science, and how does that interested kind of science does not fall into a opinion or non-science or just opinions, right? This is the first thing. And the second thing is exactly continues with that problem, not falling upon opinion. How is it that we carry critical science? What is it that what does critical science do? Does it offer thesis against the thesis of so-called traditional science that thinks of itself as disinterested, objective, and all of that? And how is it that critical science then vindicates the very not only the fact, but the very ethical meta level in a certain sense, whereby one is able to criticize the present. Does it offer a positive thesis about it? The way he says it doesn't. It just it is a way of reflecting on the genesis of the thesis of traditional science in a certain sense. So in a sense, the reflection of the genesis of traditional science is a reflection of the material conditions of what is offered to thinking in a specific historical horizon. So the method is not a method of finding positive theses and offering them against false theses, but it is the method of immanently analyzing the relationship between these existing traditional theses and the means through which they are put together and the means through which they circulate in the social sphere in a certain sense. So here we are already kind of anticipating the fact that this idea of critical science will turn into ideology critique at some point. But before that, he goes from the definition of critical science in this very Horkheimer kind of way, comparing traditional and critical theory, to then hermeneutics, because hermeneutics is a kind of literary science that brings in the reader. So it's not just a formal analysis of the text, but brings in the reader and the relationship between the contents of the text and the reader to bear upon the literary text, which by itself, in a certain sense, start bringing the social sphere back into the way one reads, right? But then in hermeneutics, it lacks the critical element. In hermeneutics, as we will see, he says like, yeah, as it appears in Gadamer, for instance, you have like a prejudice, and the prejudice is a kind of ingrained traditional societal kind of belief that you bring to bear on any kind of texts that is offered to read, right? And then how again are you able to criticize this prejudice? Because the prejudice is an important thing. You can't really get rid of the prejudice, but you can criticize it. You can give an account of its genesis, therefore making it unnecessary, making it changeable, amenable to change and critique, right? So this is the crux of the issue. So in a certain sense, critical science seems to be a different kind of activity than traditional science in that sense. It's like an activity that makes like a meta-critique, actually, of traditional science instead of battling traditional science in its own arena by offering a different thesis, like to the thesis offered by traditional science. So this is, in a nutshell, the way he's building and constructing the concept of a critical science of literature here. So this way he says, rather it examines the categories of traditional science to discover what questions they permit one to ask and what other questions are already excluded at a theoretical level, precisely as a consequence of a choice of categories. So what are the categories that are being employed as a result of the historical social process? Yeah, I'm tempted here to already jump into like real abstraction. Those who know me already sensing like, how is it that then the categories are historically fashioned not by, you know, any isolated individual thinker's mind, but also by the social praxis. And then there comes real abstraction and all the stuff that I've been doing latest years, but I'll refrain from that right now. We'll get to that at some point though. Okay. Any question about this? This is very, very beginning. If not, I'll just go on. So, as I told you, from hermeneutics then to ideology critique. So he says, like, to identify a text as a poem, we must fall back on the knowledge we already possess, and that is handed down by tradition. There is even, I mean, there's a lot that could be patched within this concept of tradition. Again, those who know me would say, like, it's more than just tradition, it's also possessing a form of life in a certain sense, in the visible face of which is a spoken language in a certain sense, and a set of language games and all of that. So to identify a text as a poem means you just don't see letters on the page. Of course, you know what a poem is, and to know what a poem is to know the social practice of writing poems and of reading poems and all of that. So this vindicates the idea that a poem is not just a natural object that one finds in the world, like it's a cultural, of course, it's a cultural artifact, but as a cultural artifact, you have to bring to bear to it in order to identify it, even in a very kind of elementary sense, what it is, right? A certain culturally determined and constructed form of understanding, right? So to identify a text as a poem, we must fall back on the knowledge we already possess, and that is handed down by tradition. Scientific analysis of literature begins the moment one recognizes that the immediacy with which we perceive a poem as a poem is illusory, shine, like a is. I think it's maybe a reference to Hegel here, but anyway, this we don't need to go there. Like it's a illusory kind of immediacy, like it's we could say like it's second nature, right? Mental objectifications do not have the status of facts. They are mediated by traditions. Hence, cognition of literature can be achieved only by dealing critically with tradition. Since we owe the insight that mental objectifications are mediated through tradition to hermeneutics, it is logical to begin our reflections with a critique of traditional hermeneutics. So here is like how he justifies the fact that it comes from that first desideratum of a critical science of literature to hermeneutics. Like, why is it that he's bringing hermeneutics here uh, to build this argument? Because hermeneutics is a certain kind of science of literature, or is an approach to the reading of literary texts that emphasize the relationship of to tradition as a means to gain the understanding of a poem, of a biblical text, for instance. Hermeneutics is very important in biblical studies, and or sacred text, or a work of, or any kind of work of literature reading. So he continues, Gadamer uses the term prejudice in a broader sense than is common in colloquial language and without pejorative meaning. With reference to the process of understanding unfamiliar texts, prejudice means that the interpreter is not merely a passive recipient who assimilates himself to a text, as it were, but someone who brings with him certain ideas that necessarily enter into the interpretation of the text. Application is every interpretation prompted by a specific contemporary interest. So these are the two categories that that he takes from Gadamer, that is he comments upon. One is application, this last one that is very, very quickly mentioned, and the other one is prejudice. So prejudice is that the fact that you have already like you bring with you a previous understanding that comes from the education and the relationship to a certain body, a certain body of work that you already read, that you already came in contact with, and that gives you the necessary means through which you can identify a poem or a sacred text or whatever. And an application is the way you interpret a new text in a way that is prompted by an interest of yours. So this is kind of the relationship of reading, of the reader to the text is conditioned twice, like by prejudice and by application, which is a form of interest. How is it that I'm going to apply this new text to my life in a certain sense? And this is not only for any kind of, let us say, practical kind of recipe or anything like that, but apply in the sense of applying a work of literature. Like, how is it that I'm going to apply the lessons of War and Peace, Tolstoy's War and Peace, to my life, or anything like that? So application is every interpretation prompted by a specific contemporary interest. Or how are we to understand the current conflicts in the world through Tolstoy's text, for instance? This would be an example of application in that sense. Okay. Yeah, somebody rose a hand. Do you have a question?
Yes, I have a question. What does he mean by mental objectifications? He uses it quite often in the text. I'm not really sure what it means.
Okay. Oh yeah, that's a good question. I didn't reflect about that explicitly. I would say mental objectifications there's a bunch of things. He really doesn't give an explicit concept, so this would be mine instead of his, I would say. But to make sense of what he means, I would say it's not only a mental, it's not only comprehension or understanding, right? Like, of course, it has to do with understanding. So what I feel is the dualism or duality in place here is between facts and understandings, so to speak. So an understanding seems to be like an interpretation. So we get back to that very familiar duality between facts and interpretations or something like that. But I think mental objectifications, it brings to it more than just understandings or interpretations in a certain sense. And I think that has to do with the fact of the identification of the objects themselves, which means, as I said, like, one thing is to compare two different poems, and one poem you might understand well, and the other one you don't understand. You just read it and it doesn't speak to you. And the other thing is to, I don't know, encounter a rock and a poem and objectify the poem as a poem. It seems to me that there are more superior, in a certain sense, in a kind of hierarchical sense, like cognitive functions in identifying the poem than identify the rock. Like, the rock is basically a natural object. But to identify a poem is not just to identify a piece of paper where there are things written on it, right? So a mental objectification, seems to me, has to do with how you objectify that which has a material object as support, but it is also an object within the realm of culture and tradition. So a piece of paper with something written can be a letter, can be anything else. So how is it that you identify it as a poem? So for me, the objectification of these understandings means they are not only understandings that we bring to bear to the bare facts of natural objects, but these mental objectifications kind of generate a certain kind of cultural ontology, so to speak. So this is how I would, I mean, of course, I'm bringing a lot of maybe heavy vocabulary from other areas, but this is how I would interpret what he means with mental objectifications that are mediated through tradition to hermeneutics in a certain sense. So, which means like we live in a certain world of sense where we identify objects that are not only natural objects, but they are also tradition objects that are tradition dependent or cultural dependent objects. Therefore, they bring with it this mental objectification process in order to be identified as what they are in a certain sense. This would be like the way I would parse this. Did I answer you, or are you satisfied or not?
I am satisfied, but I think I'm still confused for further usage of this word. I mean that he uses very often in various contexts, I think.
Okay, we can go back to that. If you find another use that you find suspicious, you can raise your hand. We can discuss this use. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah.
Neve?
Hi, yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, of course.
So yeah, no, I just wondering on the back of that, do you think it's related to complete determination? You know, I'm bound to raise Kant here, but because it comes up later in the
I was
text.
expecting that already.
Yeah. So it does come up later, very soon in the text anyway, about you know, the relationship to the categories, you know, and for the kind of conditions for the possibility of categorical thinking, there has to be a kind of a complete determination of all of the objects kind of thought. So I don't know whether he's kind of preparing for that, but yeah, do you think?
Yeah, there's not much Kant in his text. I mean, not sure how far you got. The third chapter has like a kind of very brief approach to the third critique and static judgments, this kind of thing. But I think it's kind of implicit. Like Kant is like second nature for any kind of German theorist in a certain sense, almost Kant and Hegel. So I think it's as like the use of shine here. I think it's Hegelian, but I mean we don't need it. But I think it's kind of second nature for these guys, German theorists. So I'll say like yeah, it's I think it's a Kantian problem. It's a Kantian problem. And there is like implicitly this idea, this very idea that the categories we use to understand, and there's the idea that these categories are historical, which is not Kantian, but this is kind of the Hegelian Marxist kind of supplements to that in a certain sense. But he doesn't have, this is very interesting, this is a super interesting question to me, because I mean, this is one of the things I'm interested in explicitly as an object, but this is not an object for Bürger exactly. It's more something in the background. What he wants is, of course, to basically found a critical science of literature, not found, but justify a critical science of literature, and then to uphold the thesis that this critical science of literature or art, it's more here he's talking about literature, but it's art in general. And the second thesis is that there is a certain historical stage of art that makes it so that we are able to describe the structural components of art, which is given by the first aestheticism and then the avant-garde, right? So I think the Kantian problem of not only understanding, and maybe that kind of relates to Lynn's question about mental objectification, is not only understanding, because understanding, the way we just use it colloquially, is too superficial to kind of encompass what's being thought here. I think mental objectifications kind of brings with it a certain ontological bent in a certain sense, and ontology in the Kantian sense, like it has to do with the categories of the understanding that we have, like that which appears and it's determined, subsumed under a concept, so to speak. So, but the thing is that these categories are historical. He doesn't have an overt, explicit account of how is it that they are historical. For instance, one of the writers, theorists that I like, and I already taught in the New Center is Zonhattel, and Zonhattel has the historical account or supposedly has, or has a candidate of a historical account of the emergence of the Kantian categories precisely, right? Bürger is not doing this here overtly, at least, but it seems to be in the background. This idea of determination in the Kantian sense through the use of concepts, but these concepts has to be somehow related to the praxis, to the social practice. There's something in the social practice that makes it that we get these concepts from the social practice, or in a certain sense. Here, for instance, I think the very structural account is about the autonomization of social spheres, for instance, and it's very interesting because it's not something that we approach as a natural object. How is it that we just now know that art is a separate thing? It's just a historical kind of unfolding whereby a subsystem gains autonomy, and the autonomy of the subsystem gives us the means through which we are able to understand this subsystem specifically. This he gives us because he's interested in the autonomization of the subsystem of art, but he doesn't give us an account or overall account of how is it that categories are fashioned in the social fabric, which has to do with real abstraction, as I was saying before. If there is an interest in that, I can kind of supplement this seminar at some point with that. But we have the opportunity to discuss this a little bit in the fourth session, because Martin uses the Zonhettelian real abstraction concept, and also I use it against Martin in my paper, which is actually very central to that paper. So there's an account of functional bootstrapping out of social practice. How is it that we can do something in practice before we think that thing, and it becomes a way through which we think things. Like, this is very interesting. I'm not sure I answered you, but I mean, I just was jamming over your proposed.
Oh, that's great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, going on. So the interpreter, in other words, approaches the text to be understood with prejudices, interprets it with respect to his own situation, and applies it to that situation. To this extent, Gadamer is correct. But the content he gives the concepts has been justifiably criticized, especially by Jürgen Habermas. Gadamer turns his insight into understanding as a structure of prejudice into a rehabilitation of prejudice as such. Why? Because it doesn't have a meta critique, right, of prejudice. Like, we can agree that a certain form of prejudice is necessary in order to approach the world in any way. But is the specific prejudice that you have justified universally, right? So this happens when Gadamer defines understanding as the placing of oneself within a process of tradition. For the conservative Gadamer, understanding ultimately comes to mean submission to the authority of tradition. In contrast, Habermas has called attention to the power of reflection that makes transparent the structure of prejudice in understanding, and thereby can also break the power of prejudice. So it seems like here in Habermas' account that Bürger is offering as an alternative, yes, prejudice is important because a cultural object is not a natural object, so it's not just like a rock. We have to identify a poem as a poem, and that comes with a certain form of prejudice, non-pejorative use in a non-pejorative sense. Like, we learned what is a poem, right? But at the same time, like, you have to have the means through which you could suspend or criticize this prejudice. Otherwise, it falls into what he's saying, like the authority of the submission to the authority of tradition. So this would be reflection. And I think what Bürger is talking in this beginning of the book is all about reflection. Reflection is the kind of center notion here, I think. Be it the reflection of the theory within its own historicity, or the reflection of the object within its own historicity, or the reflection between theory and object that has also a reflective relation that we'll see shortly how it works. So it's very interesting that the power of reflection that makes transparent the structure of prejudice in understanding, and thereby can also break the power of prejudice. Yes, because the prejudice, that the same prejudice that we use to understand a certain phenomenon could be also, or is also, the product of a certain historical dynamics, right? Therefore, the sole universal power of said prejudice is broken by the fact that we understand its genesis as a part of a overall process of understanding and the relationship between subject and object that is within history. Habermas makes clear that to an autonomous hermeneutics, tradition appears as an absolute power only because the system of labor and domination do not enter its field of vision. Therefore, as I was saying, the power of the description of the genesis, in a certain sense. One way of putting this this dichotomy between Habermas and Gadamer, or between, let us say, critical theory and hermeneutics, would be explanation versus understanding, in a certain sense. So to understand would mean to like place a certain piece of information within the tradition. Therefore, there is a certain way that you're supposed to understand a certain object within the tradition itself, right? Whereas explanation is actually the genetic explanation of the emergence of said understanding, in a certain sense. So the very blind spot that that hermeneutics would have for the material conditions of emergence of the objects and of the understanding, the traditional understanding itself, explains the fact that there's then an autonomy, a spurious autonomy to the, let us say, traditional understanding, instead of just, recognizing that this traditional understanding is part and parcel of reading any text, but it comes with a certain genetic history whereby you can explain like this, its emergence, and therefore criticize its sufficiency by explaining its emergency and treating it like a moment within a more encompassing process, right? So he thereby defines the point where a critical hermeneutics would have to start from these systems of labor and domination, right? So hermeneutics, whose goal is not the mere legitimation of traditions, but the rational examination of their claim to validity, passes over into the critique of ideology. This is very interesting. Passes over is like also a Hegelian kind of turn of phrase. Like, if you want hermeneutics to just not be the legitimation of tradition, and if it's kind of a certain identity, if it is to be the rational examination of the claim of validity, it becomes the critique of ideology, just by wanting to be this rational examination, right? Is not something added that makes it, oh, now I'm not doing hermeneutics, I'm doing critique of ideology. No, critique of ideology is the hermeneutics of the genetic conditions of emergence of these understandings and their claim of true validity, because it includes then the historical material dynamics of constitution of these understandings. Okay, so this is critique of ideology just by itself. It passes over into one concept, one idea passes over into the other, because the first one was unilateral, also Hegelian vocabulary, but it was unilateral. It had a blind spot. Once the blind spot is taken account of, it passes over to critique of the ideology. That the concept of ideology comprises a multiplicity of partly contradictory meanings is well known. It is indispensable to a critical science, nonetheless, because it permits one to think the contradictory relationship of intellectual objectification, sorry, there's a typo there, objectifications and social reality. So again, the problem of mental objectification, intellectual objectification, which was Lynn's question here. So it's interesting to see, like, this is why you also need this concept of intellectual objectifications, because intellectual objectifications or mental objectifications seems to be the result of the application of the categories that we have to understand things. So I don't know, ideological, classic form of ideological critique would be to occlude the value of labor in a commodity, for instance, like the intellectual objectification that is available within Western liberal society would be like just, you know, objects for purchase, like use values or something like that, that occlude what is the process of production of those use values that you have access to in a certain sense. So this why is it that I'm saying this is because it's talking about the contradictory relationship between these. So if you have like a certain set of intellectual objectifications that are available in a certain historical horizon, right? And this would have a contradictory relation to social reality, because these very intellectual objectifications doesn't take into account the genesis of these objectifications that it takes as actual. So this is why it's contradictory. There's a contradiction there. Like you're not always at the level of the description of the whole of social reality. The intellectual objectifications are results of social reality, of course, but they are partial results that are not at the level of the reconstruction of the whole of social practice. Lynn, again?
Yes, I would like to ask again about the difference between objectifications and social reality. So does he imply that reality is something that is rather objective, so that it's something that is not looked upon, but just exists within the sum of all relations? Or how would you describe the differences between this perception?
Yes, I think this is a classical distinction in Marxism. I would say social reality is that which is done by and through practice. It's not necessarily like in the absence of any social sphere. At least in Marxist science, it's not mea su, it's not speculative realism. We're not talking about reality in the absence of humans or labor or any thinker. But yes, we are talking about a certain kind of reality, and that kind of reality that is constituted by practice and not necessarily reflection. So there is a certain, the idea, in a nutshell, the idea is that, well, there's a struggle for reproduction of the conditions of life, and these are not necessarily reflected in thought. So practice itself guides the genesis of the social forms that enable the social reproduction itself, because the reproduction of the individual's life is also predicated upon the reproduction of the social life that he's embedded in. So these material dynamics has a certain degree of autonomy, power, or the, you know, mental objectification, mental image you might have of these social dynamics. So in that sense, I would say intellectual objectifications are contradictory in relation to social reality, means that we are not always adequately representing the practical dimension that is present in social reality, and also to connect to the beginning of the session, the unjust conditions whereby the social reality is reproduced. So we need critique for that, and critique is something that is happening in thought, but it is also a form of practice. It's a very important thing. I think it's a very important and paragraph that is not read very often, that he says, like, maybe I got it here, I don't know, maybe I copied, that he says, like, ideology critique is a doing, is a certain form of doing. Of course, any act of thought is also an act in a certain sense, but not every act is reflected in thought. So in a certain sense, this is why we need critique, which is a certain form of thought, thinking, but it's a form of thinking that is begotten by certain attitudes and certain practical doings too, that enable us to see what was once concealed in a certain sense. Well, the very example here, Bürger's example, is that we only see the institution of art because there is a certain practice of art that upholds art as autonomous. And then we see art, as a separate thing. We couldn't see art as art before that moment because it wasn't separate. And this separation was done through practice, or the sheer practice of artists doing that and getting to that, social stage, that's that point. And that creates the object of this science of literature, or this science of art in a certain sense. So this is also the weaving between the historical condition of theory and the historical condition of the object, and the condition of theory and the object. The object is not just created by the theory, but the object is created by the very social reality that enables the object to appear as an object for theory, in a certain sense, and also the fact that you are engaged in a certain stage of critical theory that enables us to also to see the object for what it is. So it's like this is like a complicated dialectics, like fourfold, I would say, dialectics in a certain sense. So well, but the short answer would be not. I wouldn't say completely autonomous. The object, I mean the object here is not a completely autonomous reality, autonomous from the human, as we've seen, for instance, speculative realism, but the autonomous reality in the sense that it's the reality created by practice within the necessity of the social reproduction of the individual. Does that answer?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So again, the contradictory structure of ideology. So he uses a quote from Marx about religion. So Marx says, "It is a fantastic realization of the human being because the human being has attained no true reality. Thus, the struggle against religion is indirectly the struggle against that world of which religion is the spiritual aroma." There's a typo there. "The wretchedness of religion is at once an expression of and a protest against real wretchedness. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people." So this is like the ideology. Religion here is the model he uses from the young Marx in his ideological critique, is that religion has a moment of truth. Religion is not all that, religion, according to Marx. Religion has a moment of truth, like it speaks of true wretchedness, but it offers a false solution to true wretchedness. So in a certain sense, it is both false and true at the same time. So this is the contradictory kind of structure of ideology. It is in religion that this twofold character of ideology is brought out. It says, here's Bürger. 1, religion is an illusion. Man projects into heaven what he would like to see realized on earth. To the extent that man believes in God, who is no more than an objectification of human qualities, this comes from Feuerbach's critique, that Marx by then was very influenced by Feuerbach at this moment in his writing. He succumbs to an illusion. But religion also contains an element of truth. It is an expression of real wretchedness, for the realization of humanity in heaven is merely a creation of the mind and denounces the lack of real humanity in human society. And it is a protest against real wretchedness, for even in their alienated form, religious ideals are a standard of what ought to be. So there is a moment of truth in religion in the sense that it elicits a standard of what ought to be, but it puts this standard in an extra earthly reality instead of locating this wretchedness here and now and kind of correctly locating from the Marxian point of view the solution for this wretchedness in revolutionary practice, so to speak. So it should also be noted that in this model, ideologies are not simply understood as a copy, that is a duplication of social reality, but as its product. This is also very important from Lynn's perspective, the perspective of Lynn's question. Not a duplication, but its product. So we are not duplicating, we don't really have transparency of what we are doing according to the Marxian framework. But, you know, cognitive elements or cognitive categories are ways of coping. First and foremost, are ways of coping with the environment from a materialist point of view. So we have the categories we need to cope in a certain sense. We have our ways of coping, but this doesn't what that means that whatever the structure of this social reality is, it's not transparent to the ones enacting it. So we try to adjust the cognitive categories to the social reality at large, but not being transparent, it also means it's not complete. So, and this is what it means when he says like it's not simply as a copy, but is a product. So we think what we think because we do what we do, but that doesn't mean that we think what we do. So they are the result of an activity that responds to a reality experienced as inadequate. The human being from whom true reality, that is the possibility of a humane unfolding in reality, is withheld, is forced into a fantastic realization of himself in the religious sphere. So there's this compensating kind of thing. Ideologies are not a mere reflex of certain social conditions. They are parts of the social whole. So this is also a second, maybe she should have divided this, because first, it's a product, it's not a duplication, right? Whatever social form you are enacting doesn't come with its picture. We don't have like the adequate picture or the adequate description. We just do it, take part in it, and we try to understand it. So this partial understanding gives rise to ideologies. And then ideologies are not a mere reflex then of certain social conditions. They are parts of the social whole. This is also important because the very understandings that we have become part of the circuit itself. So at first we have like the enaction of a certain social form without the corresponding or adequate understanding. But then the partial or ideological understandings that we have are also part of the enaction of this social whole and become parts of the reproduction of the social whole. In the other seminar, we were talking about the function of ideology for social reproduction according to Althusser, the last seminar that I gave. So it's basically here he's saying that like this let us say ideology as the attempt of understanding this becomes not only a form of understanding from afar the social whole, but it becomes part of the social whole in the sense that we do things because of ideology too. So if we go back to the last seminar, but I mean, it's not necessary for everyone here, it's just a handy example. Like for Althusser, he would say like the juridical ideology, the religious ideology, the educational ideology, all these apparatuses, like they have their own kind of self-images, so to speak. And we live and act according to certain self-images of these apparatuses in a certain sense. So if we are brought religious, we will behave according to a certain set of values. This is one set of ideological values in a certain sense. So this is why ideology is not only a problem, an epistemological problem understood from afar the social whole, but it's part and parcel of the social whole, and it becomes part of the explanation of why the social whole it is what is as it is. It also, so ideology itself is duplicated, right? You could have like an ideological description of the function of ideology. So in a certain sense, criticism is not regarded as a judgment. This is the thing that I thought it was important that I mentioned. Criticism is not regarded as a judgment that harshly sets one's own views against the untruth of ideology, but rather as a production of cognitions. Criticism attempts to separate the truth of ideology from its untruth. Krinein, the Greek word for criticism, means to part, to separate. So this is like criticism as the production of cognitions, in a certain sense. How is it that we can produce the cognitions of that which already produce cognitions in the ideological form? Like it's a kind of this cognitive battlefield in a certain sense, where we have to make the meta critique of ideology in a certain sense, to offer the genesis of these ideological ideas, and then therefore place them into a broader whole in a certain sense, where their sufficiency is limited. Therefore, therefore it is criticized, right? Yeah, I think that's very important. I mean, the concept of ideology, I think it connects nicely to last seminar, as Neve was saying in the beginning of the session. But yeah, we'll move forward. What Lukács and Adorno adopt on the Marxist model of ideology critique is the dialectical analysis of the ideological object. It is seen as contradictory, and it is the task of criticism to spell out this contradictory nature. There are two differences, though. First, for Marx, the critique of religion and the critique of society belong together. Criticism destroys the religious illusions, not the elements of truth in religion, in order to make men capable of action, right? So there's like a more direct route between critique and action. In applying this model to individual literary works and groups of works, this goal cannot be taken over totally, because literature does not have the same status as religion. The ideology critical analysis of a work is a critique of society as well, but only in a mediated manner. So Marx, one of these difference means like that for Marx, like the criticism of religion would enable one to act. Maybe, for instance, engage in revolutionary action, because the only way to attain heaven would be to engage in revolutionary action and not to be praying in a church or something like that. There's a direct route. For a literary work, the literary work is already a representation of this reality in a certain sense. So to make an ideology critical analysis, the way he says it, means to locate within this representation that is the work, the contradictory elements also. So it's supposed to show in the work the way these contradictory elements in society appear within a certain work of art. But by doing this, you're not engaging in revolutionary action by itself. It's like it's more mediated in the sense that we are criticizing or locating within a representation the contradictory elements that might be occluded there. Okay, so this is one of the difference. Sorry, yeah. Second difference, the analysis, and here we start the analysis of function, which is very important. The ideology critical analysis of individual works differs from the Marxian model in yet another respect. By and large, it does not deal with the social function of the ideological object. Whereas Marx discusses both the contradictory nature of religion's social function and its contradictory character, being consolation, it prevents any action that would promote social change. Lukács and Adorno's analysis largely excludes the problem of function. So within Marx's thinking, where he wants to route one towards revolutionary action, of course, the ideological character of religion means it's contradictory, but it also plays a function, and a function of deactivating criticism of the social reality as it is, in a certain sense. So Marxian analysis of religion would say that by offering extra worldly consolation, it deactivates the impulse to change the world as it is. So there is a function from the point of view of the social reproduction of the system as it is. So this is what function means here. So, and it's important to bear in mind that not always these functions are the product of of the cunning of a class or of somebody. Sometimes they are just the byproduct of the reproduction of the system at large. So you can locate a function for a certain image of the world that is in circulation within the reproduction of that world as it is, in a certain sense. So there's a part there that gets reproduced together with the rest under the impulse of the reproduction, guided by the survival of the, or at least partially guided by the belief that the survival of the worker is predicated upon the survival of the system at large. So it's important not to, I would say, personalize this function. It's not like, it's not necessarily like somebody is out to deceive you. Sometimes it is, many times, but it's not always like that. But then he says, like, Lukács and Adorno excludes the problem of function, which means what is the ideological function of a novel or of an artwork in that sense? What is its function? So they don't have an account of function, according to Bürger. So he said, like, Lukács and Adorno avoidance of any discussion of the social function of art becomes understandable when one realizes that it is the autonomy aesthetic which, in however modified form, is the focal point of their analysis. The autonomy aesthetic, however, contains a definition of the function of art. It is conceived as a social realm that is set apart from the means-end rationality of daily bourgeois existence. Precisely for this reason, it can criticize such an existence. Here, the emphasis is mine, because this will be a central point of the second session, when Adorno will insist upon the necessity of the unity of the artwork and the separation of the artwork from the social sphere, because this separation is exactly what makes it exactly without function, without a function defined in the sense of the means and rationality of everyday life in the bourgeois society. So the function of art in that sense is to be functionless, right? So this is why you don't have an analysis of the function of art in a certain sense, which means, like, for Adorno, it seems like authentic art has it is a protest against the generalized functionalization of society as such. We could say something asymptotically approaching that. According to Adorno, there are social reasons why bourgeois culture has failed to be egalitarian as it should be. Only in the isolated form of monad-like works of art can truth still be spoken about this society. This is the function of art that Adorno can refer to as functionlessness. Like, the function of art then is to be this functionless realm, whereby the functionlessness itself is a protest against the generalized functionalism of bourgeois society. And this will be one, I'd say, one disagreement, I think, important disagreement between the account of Bürger and the account of Adorno. Because Bürger seems to think that the avant-gardist impulse of the destruction of the boundary between art and life would be a positive thing. It just couldn't be successful in the context of bourgeois society. But it seems that then Bürger would be like, how to say that? Reluctantly in accordance with Adorno, that, yeah, because of that, right, the boundary is important and the work function, the artwork function is important, but it's the result of a certain failure of the avant-gardist impulse, in a certain sense. Not because of the avant-garde itself, but because of the social conditions. Anyway. So he says then that there's no analysis of function, then because the function of art is to be without function. And then he introduces the analysis of function in Marcuse. So what's important in Marcuse and what he will take from Marcuse is like an institutional domain where you could assign art as such a function. Whereas in Adorno and Lucas, they're always about individual artworks. In Marcuse, there is like a aesthetic sphere, like, and this will be very important for Bürger because he will say, as we say, like this is part of the argument. I think a very important part of the argument is that this dialect is the dynamics that give rise to the avant-garde and to the criticism of the bourgeois artwork is only readable from the point of view of the subsystem of art, not from the point of view of individual artwork. Just the individual artworks, you have like an atomization. You can't have really how to read off the avant-gardist impulse, the criticism that he's supposed to be. So the analysis of function in Marcuse is fundamentally different according to Bürger. So he says Marcuse outlines the global determination of art's function in bourgeois society, not the function of individual artworks, but the global determination of art's function, which is a contradictory one. On the one hand, it shows forgotten truths, thus it protests against a reality in which these truths have no validity. Again, you have something in common with the Adornian idea that what is functionless, what is not determined by the means and rationality, these are the forgotten truths. And on the other, such truths are detached from reality through the medium of aesthetic semblance against shine. Art thus stabilizes the very social conditions against which it protests. So it's very similar to religion here in Marcuse's, religion according to Marx in Marcuse's reading. So you can have the realization of these forgotten truths, these desires, these experiences within the fruition of art. And because you have that within the fruition of art, you won't be struggling for that within the social texture at large, which becomes what's the translation for that? Which is characterized by the atrophy of experience, as they say. So the term affirmative, therefore, which is the title of Marcuse's essay, The Affirmative Character of Culture, the term affirmative, therefore, characterizes the contradictory function of a culture that retains remembrance of what could be, but is simultaneously justification of established form of existence. So in that sense, it reminds us of the function of religion as Marx was proposing. Lynn, again.
Yes, I was wondering also when I was reading the text, what is implied by remembrance of what could be, in a way that a lot of art of 20th century and art in general doesn't necessarily show the ideal picture of life without social injustices. So I mean that a lot of art actually tries to criticize or show the violence behind these mechanisms. So would the showing of the structures behind society be also in the category of what could be, and thus kind of restricting art from turning into action from this perspective? Or is it some kind of particular art which is like religion trying to show rather the good life while providing with an illusion?
Yeah, this is a very, very complicated question. But I would say much in the same vein that I was saying in the beginning, like critical science having like an implicit set of ideals in a certain sense. There is a normative ideal into built in according to Bürger. I think he's right up to a point. The idea of the remembrance of what could be, then it's not necessarily part of the content of the artwork. I think what Marcuse, both Marcuse, Adorno, all these guys are trying to say is that the very fact of being an artwork, in a certain sense, is a remembrance of what could be. In the sense of Adorno, because you have something that is just for the fruition. It's just, there is a disinterest of art that becomes its critical purchase, in a certain sense. But of course, that disinterest does not manifest in the same way as like 18th century art would manifest. So in Adorno, you have also, as you are saying, Lynn, like this already, we are dealing with the way art could reflect critically on this atrophy of experience itself, of which is supposedly an exception. But the very fact that you have an artwork existing is an act of protest in the sense of Adorno, for instance. And an example of that would be his endorsement of Samuel Beckett, for instance. Samuel Beckett, like I wouldn't say like anybody would say like Samuel Beckett is portraying like a desirable state of affairs in the content of his plays. But there is something to the affiguration or representation of a certain state of affairs in his plays that enables one to kind of map or cognitively map exactly the state of experience in the society at large, in a certain sense. And by itself, this impulse, this critical act itself would carry with it implicitly a remembrance of what could be, because it is criticizing in the name of something that could be that actually we can't offer a picture of. If we really are to believe the revolutionary impulse behind these thinkers here, we can't really offer an image of what could be, but there is an implicitness, implicit remembrance of what could be, and the pleasure also that is elicited by the participation in art making in that sense is also a dimension of that is absolutely crucial to art making. But it is a contradictory element, because at the same time it presentifies that which is lacking in social praxis at large. There's this pleasure in participating in a meaningful kind of thing, meaningful beyond the means ends rationality. But at the same time, it gets kind of localized in the social sphere, and very localized, and like there is this spot where you can have that. You can't have that outside of this spot. So I think it's more about the form of the enjoyment and the art practices than the contents of the work themselves. Even though the criticism can appear as content in a certain diffracted form here, or refracted form, in a refracted way in the artwork itself. But then I was saying, like, this is what's common between Marcuse and Adorno, but there is this further step that Bürger attributes to Marcuse, which is the fact that he individualized the art function at large as this. So there is like let us say there is an aesthetic ideology. If we want to build upon, for instance, Althusser's idea that you have different types of ideology, what Marcuse is saying is that there is an artistic ideology. There is an ideology that is art, not art as art, not the individual artwork. So this is like the step further, the one step further from what Adorno is saying is what Bürger is saying, that it's in Marcuse. Like, yeah, it's art is the sphere where you can do this. Maybe it's a bit complicated, but there is an artist, philosopher that I like that sometimes pops up. I think in every fucking seminar I give, this guy pops up somehow, which is Henry Flint. There's a guy from New York that proposed the concept of constitutive dissociations at a point. We'll be talking a little bit maybe about that. Probably he'll pop up in the last session when we'll talk about social dissonance. And constitutive dissociation is the way he reads, for instance, certain works of the avant-garde, for instance, Cage's Silent Piece. He says like it's a dissociation between the goal and between the object and the goal of the activity. So he says like the instigator changes the aim of the activity without declaring. So you go to a concert, you're supposed to hear music coming out of instruments and stuff. What Cage does, like no, you won't be listening to that. So you change the aim of the situation without declaring. This is Henry's definition. I think it's not a complete definition. I think it's a partial definition. I don't think it's that. For me, constitutive dissociation is a means to create different forms of practice that are not subsumed under existing categories of practice. And you do that by dissociating, by rupturing the inferential links between, motivation and result. So you have all these weird things, like for instance, Flint offers created the concept of concept art, not conceptual art, but concept art, which he thinks is like, it's like a form of art, the material of which is concepts, but in the sense that they become problems for the exact sciences. So this is really wild. Like this piece that he says, it's only the title. It's called works such that no one knows what's going on. It's only the title, because by definition, you can't really compose a piece like that. You're just declaring its existence. But once you declare its existence, where is it? Yeah, it's saying no one knows what's going on. But then how you play it? So he puts it in a program, works such that no one knows what's going on. But then there's nothing. Nobody plays nothing. Like there's no concert. But you put it in a concert. So you create like this contradictory situation because you like sever the links between expectation and result. Why is it that I'm saying all of that? Is because some people, Flint is not taken very seriously because people think, this is just, artist stuff. Like this is eccentricities of an artist. This is artist shit. Like what? Constitutive dissociation. I think they take it, it's the opposite actually. It's not that constitutive dissociation is an artist thing. Is that any kind of constitutively dissociated situation that you can come up with will become art. Because art is the only place where you can have constitutively dissociated situations. All other all other spheres of activity, they are means to an end. So you can't really sever links and, create a weird social morphology. You can't do that. If you do that, it's art. It's not that because it's art you do that. No, it's the opposite. Because you do that, it becomes art, because everybody will say it is art and will understand it as art, because art remains the only place where you can do that. So in a certain sense, this explains the failure of Flint, coming up with different forms of practice or of problems for the exact science from the realm of concept art. Not because he comes from an artistic point of view, but because anything that might obtain or might have these properties will be understood as being art. And this is why is that? Exactly what Marcuse, the reason is exactly what Marcuse is saying. It's the one place where you have this place of experimentation with forms of action, because you are outside the means and rationality in a certain sense. So this is just jamming over the question a little bit, but thank you. So and then because of that, as I was saying, like he's considering that Marcuse is able to individualize the art sphere. So he said there's the introduction of the concept of the institution of art institution or institution of art. Marcuse's definition of the function of culture in bourgeois society does not relate to individual artistic works, but to their status as objects that are set apart from the struggle of everyday existence. The model provides the important theoretical insight that works of art are not received as single entities, but within institutional frameworks and conditions that largely determine the function of the works. This is very important. And it also speaks to the beginning when we were talking about hermeneutics, the role of prejudice. Like, you only see an artwork as an artwork because you have the relevant concepts, the relevant prejudice, so to speak. But there it was more about the tradition, and here is about our institutional framework. So the institutional framework, of course, is part and parcel of a tradition. You can only say there's an artistic tradition because there is an ongoing framework whereby you can see a certain tradition as an artistic one, even if that framework is retroactively posed by the state of the art, so to speak, the actual state of the subsystem in question. So the model provides the important theoretical insight that works of art are not received as single entities, but within institutional frameworks and conditions that largely determine the function of the works. When one refers to the function of an individual work, one generally speaks figuratively, or the consequences that one may observe or infer are not primarily a function of its special qualities, but rather of the manner which regulates the commerce with works of this kind in a given society or in a given in certain strata or classes of a society. I have chosen the term institution of art to characterize such framing conditions. So this is all important, an all important insight here, because the concept of the avant-garde will be exactly the rebellion against the institution of art within the art making itself, right? So you have to have the concept of the institution of art, which is like this domain, the domain of art making, not only the individual artwork, but the domain of the art making itself, right? It might be that the relationship between the institution of art and the actual commerce with works must be examined as historically changing one. Of course, there is an institution of art, the kind of artworks being done there might change or not the institution of art. At some point, it might individualize the institution of art as a separate thing, which is Bürger's thesis with aestheticism, that it separates art as a specific practice among practices, whereas before that, art was enmeshed within the religious or the court, or I don't know. Yeah, so that you have this also non-identity. You don't adjudicate necessarily about every individual artwork because of the state of the institution of art, but that you may have like a dialectic between those two. So, oh, this I couldn't copy because the PDF was so bad that I took a picture. The historicity of the categories. Then you have the problem of the categories again, like we'll back to this issue. Because to have an institution of art, you need to have the history of the constitution of the institution of art in order to identify it. So this brings with it the problem of the historicity. So here is also a quote: in the present context, historicizing a theory will have a different meaning. That is, the insight into the nexus between the unfolding of an object and the categories of a discipline or science. Now, you see, he was talking about the historicity of theory when he was talking about critical theory, and he was talking about the historicity of art when he was talking about the function and the constitution of the institution. And now we are talking about the historicity of the discipline according to the historicity of the object. So you have like an intimate relationship between what is thinkable and what exists, right? Understood in this fashion, the historicity of a theory is not grounded in its being the expression of a zeitgeist, like a spirit of the time, the historicist view, nor in the circumstance that it incorporates earlier theory, history as prehistory of the present. This is what I was talking at the beginning of the session too. But in the fact that the unfolding of object and the elaboration of categories are connected. Historicizing a theory means grasping this connection. It might be objected that such an enterprise cannot but lay claim to a position outside history. so that historicizing simultaneously and necessarily becomes dehistoricizing, or differently expressed, that the determination of the historicity of the language of a science presupposes a meta level from which this determination can be made, and that this meta level is necessarily meta-historic, which would then require the historicizing of this meta level, etc. Not in the sense of a separation of various levels of the language of science did we introduce the concept of historicization here, but in that of reflection, which grasps the medium of one language, the historicity, which grasps in the medium of one language the historicity of its own speech. What is meant here can be best explained by some fundamental methodological insights that Marx formulated in the introduction to the Grundrisse der Kritik der politischen Ökonomie. The example of labor, Marx writes, shows strikingly how even the most abstract categories, despite their validity, precisely because of their abstractness for all epochs, are nevertheless, in the specific character of this abstraction, themselves likewise a product of historical relations and possess their full validity only for and within these relations. So this is a very crazy idea of Marx, but the idea is as follows. Today we can look at the past and talk about labor as labor, abstracting from any empirical property of labor as such. We had like hunters, fishermen, whatever, people working in many things, sellers, whatever. These are different forms of labor. But labor as such was unthinkable, according to Marx, before it became a reality within the industrialization of labor, where, where there is an abstraction of labor that is made through the productive process. Then because we can now talk about labor as such, that is actually embedded in the value of a commodity, and this only can come about within the capitalist, full-fledged capitalist mode of production. So you have like the reality of a certain abstract category, like labor is exemplified today in the way, value is transferred to a commodity. So there's a real process, according to Marx, where labor as labor you don't care if it's somebody who's like, punching a hole and another one who's putting a screw in a certain piece of machinery that will be sold as a commodity, right? It doesn't matter which kind of labor, it's just labor. So in analogy with this, what Bürger is saying is that there is a historical process that might individualize an abstraction, therefore an universal art. It's an universal. You're not talking about any specific object. It's an universal. It might, individualize this art universal, and then you'll be able to see other things in the past as being art. The same as labor. You can see other things in the past as labor. So the current category retroactively justifies and explains the historical categories, but its literal and complete validity is due to the present context. This is what grasping the relationship between theory and object means here. So the object, which is, the different, the object, which is, for instance, the art or labor, can only reveal itself in a certain social stage where it has its full validity. You couldn't be talking about art as art in the Middle Ages, or you couldn't be talking about labor as labor in the Middle Ages. But retroactively, from the standpoint of the revealing of the universal of which it's a part, you could retroactively talk about these things as art or as labor from the point of view today, even if you are well aware of that is a retroactive gesture, and that the validity, the full validity of the notion is only actual in the current world. Okay, so this is kind of the framework about of the historicity of the category that is used to understand the dynamics of the avant-garde here. You can interrupt me if any question pops up. Okay, we're approaching the end, but I think I'll be able to finish today. I mean, I'll finish, but I think I'll be able to finish all these slides. So here, the first, he talks about two theses. Then, then the second thesis here, the avant-garde self-criticism. But the first thesis is, it is my thesis that the connection between the insight into the general validity of a category and the actual historical development, or the field to which this category pertains, and which Marx demonstrated for the example of the category of labor, also applies to the objectifications in the arts. Here also, the full unfolding of the constituent elements of a field is the condition for the possibility for an adequate cognition of that field. I'll repeat this sentence. Sentence is very important. Here, the full unfolding of the constituent elements of a field is the condition for the possibility for an adequate cognition of that field. In bourgeois society, it is only with aestheticism that the full unfolding of the phenomenon of art became a fact. And it is to aestheticism that the historical avant-garde movements respond. So there's a kind of different levels here. First level, he's not saying that the historical avant-garde responds theoretically to an idea of art. No, it responds in practice. Again, going back to the relationship between mental objectification and social reality. Avant-garde responded in practice. They just did what they did. But the explanation of what they did is that there is, and the conditions for what they did, theoretically reflected conditions, is that, yeah, there was already at that point an autonomous social sphere that is the sphere of art, where there is like functionlessness, as Adorno would say. And what the avant-garde wanted is to, what was part of the avant-gardist impulse, even if it wasn't full-fledgedly, theoretically posited, would be to destroy the boundary, so to speak. This functionlessness that is exclusive to art should be distributed in the social sphere. So art and life could again be enmeshed with one another. This would be what he thinks is the avant-gardist impulse. But was doing it in practice. And the thinking about what the avant-garde was par rapport to the aestheticism, of course, is a theoretical movement that also has as condition the full constitution of the object, art, that is also done in practice and achieved full unfolding within aestheticism. So both the practical reaction to art, that is the avant-garde, and the theoretical description of what the avant-garde is par rapport to the art world is only possible because there is a full-fledged development of the object as a separate social sphere of art as art, simpliciter, and universal art, okay? Separated from other kinds of activity. The central category of artistic means, this is kind of important. This will be important to the Lehmann session, the third session. The central category of artistic means or procedures can serve to illuminate this thesis. Through it, the artistic process of creation can be reconstructed as a process of rational choice between various techniques, the choice being made with reference to the effect that is to be attained. Such a reconstruction of artistic production not only presupposes a relatively high degree of rationality in artistic production, It also presupposes that means are freely available, no longer part of a system of stylistic norms where, albeit in mediated form, social norms express themselves. So if you are completely chained to a set of stylistic norms, and we kind of know that from like an empirical history of art, you just identify the current style with art. It's not like there isn't a universal whereby you could just abstract. Art is the stuff that I know, the stuff that I'm doing. You are bounded by a stylistic norm, so to speak. And what he says is that the avant-garde made such stylistic norms freely available because it wasn't actually defending any stylistic norms against other stylistic norms. It was a meta critique of art, of the art system itself. Therefore, there were no stakes in defending a stylistic norm. A stylistic norm was just something that appeared once the idea of art appeared as a separate sphere. So the central category of artistic means for him is something that appears in this full-fledged in this moment of aestheticism. But during the dominance of a style, I continue, the category artistic means as a general one cannot be seen for what it is because reality, it occurs only as a particular one. You only, again, you are bounded by what you know. Like art is that which I know, which is this style here and not anything else. It is, on the other hand, a distinguishing feature of the historical avant-garde movements that they did not develop a style. There is no such thing as a Dadaist or a Surrealist style. What did happen is that these movements liquidated the possibility of a period style when they raised to a principle the availability of the artistic means of past periods. So the juxtapositions, the collages, all of that, treated all the artistic means of past periods as available for intervention. So they jumped a level, so to speak. They are not debating in the same level with among styles, a style among styles. They are doing the meta critique of styles as such, and treating styles as material. Not until there is universal availability does the category of artistic means becomes a general one. What is acknowledged is simply that the possibilities of cognition, this is another sentence from another part that is important, the possibilities of cognition are limited by the real historical unfolding of the object. So there are things that are simply not visible. The theoretical category cannot appear because the object is not unfolded. It's not visible. You don't see an artistic mean as an artistic mean because it's not visible as an artistic mean. What's visible is like certain set of techniques in painting, techniques in writing, techniques in music making, but you are not individualizing these as part of one set of artistic means, which means there is an abstraction in place. And the Marxist materialist thesis here is that this abstraction done in thought has as condition a certain specific social form where it is already abstracted in reality. And what does it mean that is abstracted in reality? It just means that they are treated already in practice as separate and together. They are separate from the social world at large, but they are together as painting, music making, novel writing, poetry, etc. Okay. This is the idea of this dialectic between the constitution of the material within social reality and the theoretical constitution of the theoretical object, which is also part of not only this seminar, but the last seminar, like the idea of cognitive mapping and everything that we're dealing with. We might deal with some questions coming from that point of view for those who weren't there, yeah. So Yeah, we're approaching the end. Yeah, I think I have. I can. I think I'll get to the end. Wow. So this is very important too. Again, like this indexes a difference, this jump of one level that the avant-garde is able to do. Indexes the difference between critique and self-critique, or criticism and self-criticism. So if one wishes to use self-criticism as a historiographic category, as one describes a certain stage of development of a social formation or of a social subsystem, its meaning will first have to be precisely defined. Marx makes a distinction between self-criticism and another type, such as the critique Christianity leveled against paganism, or also that of Protestantism against Catholicism in the Grundrisse. We'll refer to this type as system immanent criticism. So what is the system here? Religion. And what is the criticism? Yeah, the criticism is between one religious idea and another. Like its characteristic is that it functions within a social institution. So he is using system here and social institution as synonym in a certain sense. To stick to, here's Marx, is a typo. Here, to stick to Marx's example, system immanent criticism within the institution of religion is criticism of specific religious ideas in the name of other ideas. In contrast to this form, self-criticism presupposes distance from mutually hostile religious ideas. This distance, however, is merely the result of a fundamentally more radical criticism, and that is the criticism of religion as an institution. So what is the form of this criticism here? You have to be able to individualize the sphere within this agonistic system immanent criticism is going on. So there is a certain type that is the type that is subsuming Christianity against paganism, Protestantism against Catholicism. This type is religion. Self-criticism is only possible when this gesture of autonomization is done, is able to be done, and his part of his idea is it has to be done in practice. It has to have been done already in practice in order for us to recognize it as, oh, okay, the system of religion, the system of art, the system of philosophy, like one philosophy against the other, or somebody who was able to make a meta-critique of philosophy. No, for instance. So self-criticism is at a distance from the criticism between ideas of the same type, so to speak. So the avant-garde as self-criticism, yeah, this applies to the avant-garde. So the avant-garde would be, like he says, my second thesis is this: with the historical avant-garde movements, the social subsystem that is art enters the stage of self-criticism. Dadaism, the most radical movement within the European avant-garde, no longer criticizes the schools that preceded it, but criticizes art as an institution and the course its development took in bourgeois society. The concept art as an institution is used here refers to the productive and distributive apparatus, and also to the ideas about art that prevail at a given time and that determine the reception of works. The avant-garde turns against both the distribution apparatus on which the work of art depends and the status of art in bourgeois society as defined by the concept of autonomy. Only after art in the 19th century, aestheticism has altogether detached itself from the praxis of life, can the aesthetic develop purely. So it's a condition for the self-criticism of art that art is detached from social praxis of life, so to speak. So this is the thesis that the first one would be the dependence between the theoretical object and the real object, in the sense of the real object detaching itself. The conditions of knowledge, the conditions of cognition comes from the categories that are generated within the social practice. And the second is like the specific thesis about art, which is like, yeah, within this framework, there is a moment where art became a different thing, a separated thing, which is aestheticism, according to him. I take aestheticism not only Oscar Wilde, literally aestheticism, but I mean the idea of art pour l'art, as we see in Baudelaire, like as we see in symbolism. That it's more like a family resemblance concept, I'd say, the use he makes here of aestheticism. It's like all the artists that were emphasizing art for art's sake in the 19th century. And because of that moment, then the avant-garde is able to say, yeah, this thing that we are doing there, why is it that we are only doing there? Like, this is the critique of the boundary. So it's the self-criticism. We're not offering another type of this thing that you are doing. We want to we want to take this thing that we are doing there in art and distribute in different practices in society. The totality of the developmental process of art becomes clear only in the stage of self-criticism. Only after art has in fact wholly detached itself from everything that is in the practice of life can two things be seen to make up the principle of development of art in bourgeois society: the progressive detachment of art from real life contexts and the correlative crystallization of a distinctive sphere of experience, i.e. the aesthetic. There is a distinct kind of course, even today, the aesthetic is very ambiguous, right? Like we always think like, oh, an aesthetic experience does not pertain only to art, but yeah, there is a use that seems to be now prevalent, that the aesthetic pertains to art, and there are aesthetic experiences that we think are aesthetic experience in an analogy with the experience one might have with art or something like that. But it wasn't always like that, as we know. Like in the time of Kant, the aesthetic was not primarily gained through the experience of art, but also the experience of nature, other kinds of experience. Here I just jumped the part on Benjamin because I think we'll have the comparison between Benjamin and Adorno will be interesting to make next week. And then I jumped to a little part on the third chapter. I didn't ask for this third chapter, but this is clear enough. I think we don't need to have read the third chapter before this. This is just like the way he's periodizing, and he's periodizing in a sense because he wants to say that there's place for disagreement. One of his criticisms he makes of Benjamin is that Benjamin doesn't periodize correctly with erotic art and non-erotic art. Like for him, Benjamin is grouping together sacred art and courtly art, for instance, under erotic art, and it's not the same. He seems like, if I remember correctly, he would say that perception of sacred art is not erotic in the sense Benjamin wants. But anyway, it's actually the erratic perception is not pertain to art. This pertain to the cult itself. But anyway, so he divides. Then he wants to, because there is this kind of place for disagreement. He's trying to divide the periodization in three different categories: the purpose of function, the production, and the reception. And he's explaining the difference in periodizations by the weight one can put in one or other of these categories. But then he makes the case that the formation of an autonomous art system is only happens in bourgeois art. So you have like purpose or function, production, and reception. Though the purpose of sacred art is to be a cult object. The production is a collective craft. Normally, the reception is also collective in the sacred kind of sacral milieu, in the sacral practice. Then you have like a sharp break in the production process between the collective craft of sacral art to the courtly art, because the production in courtly art becomes individual. So you start having the individual artist as an important name. In courtly art, the purpose of function is to represent the court, represent the prince, king, and the court. So it's a representational object made through by the production of an individual genius, artist, and the reception is collective, sociable, in the sense of the reception being done by the class for which this object is produced, and within the markers of that class, understanding of these objects. And then there's two sharp breaks with bourgeois art, because there is the function will be the portrayal of bourgeois self-understanding in bourgeois art. So you have the emphasis on the individual, also in the representative sphere. So it's the invention of that, like the intimacy as the content of art, for instance, like we can remember the Romanticism, like, I don't know, someone like Schumann, which I love, that, is always portraying himself in the works, even with, heteronyms. So you have like the portrayal of this bourgeois self-understanding of its intimate sphere, this individualized kind of social sphere. And the production is individual, and the reception is also individual, or is supposed to be individual. I think the collective and the individual kind of reception in courtly art and bourgeois art is underdeveloped here in Bürger. I'm not sure you would say in bourgeois art is completely individual, or it becomes individual after that. I made a seminar here about Jacques Attali's noise, and in Jacques Attali, we would say that the reception becomes individual only in the 20th century with the recording technologies. So you are able to listen to a record individually, for instance. Whereas, for instance, in stage arts, not only music, but the theater, it's still kind of collective or social. So I don't know. This is a bit underdeveloped, but anyway, it's an important part of the chapter three, and it's the function of this here is to make us wonder about what are these three categories for the avant-garde then. So he asked himself after these, what's the function, production, and reception? And this is, I think, is very important, because the desideratum to how to say that, destitute the boundary between art and life remains very abstract if we don't think about the practical ways where this is supposed to happen. And I think it's very interesting here what he says about production and reception, especially. So what's the function? He says, like, the function is very hard to say what's the function in the avant-garde. So the function exists in relation to the function in the aestheticist work of art. So he says, in the aestheticist work of art, the disjointure of the work and the praxis of life, characteristic of the status of art in bourgeois society, has become the work's essential content. The avant-gardist artist counters such functionlessness not by an art that would have consequences within the existing society, but rather by the principle of the sublation of art in the praxis of life. But such a conception makes it impossible to define the intended purpose of art. So it's a sublation of art to the praxis of life, which means, like, it's not to contribute to the society as it is, make art contribute to the society as it is. Like, this would be the failure of the avant-garde, according to Bürger himself. It says, like, the culture industry basically made it so that you have, mass mediatic product, and they are there. They are enmeshed in the fabric of society, but they are not, they don't have the previous function, the full function of an artistic object so much. This is something for us to discuss in the next session. I think is a kind of an important thing for the future of this theory about the avant-garde. But sublation, in the sense that could be defined as a revolutionary program to have a life that is non-separated from the aesthetic or from art. And we don't know what kind of life is that exactly. right? So it's a rebellion against the very enclosure of aesthetic experience within art. So that would be kind of the function or the what finality of purpose. From the production point of view, in its most extreme manifestation, he says the avant-garde's reply to this is not the collective as the subject of production, but the radical negation of the category of individual creation. The example is Duchamp. Duchamp is not doing like creative work. He's just like signing the objects and exposing them. So in a sense, this is not the return to a collective way of producing, but it's just the negation of a category of the individual creation. He's not the genius anymore that is creating the individual artwork. So there's a rebellion against the category of individual creation in the sense that is the exclusivity of the genius artist. And then from the point of view of reception, which I think is really important here, given the avant-gardist intention to do away with art as a sphere that is separate from the practice of life, it is logical to eliminate the antithesis between producer and recipient. It is no accident that both Tristan Tzara's instructions for the making of a Dadaist poem and Breton's for the writing of automatic texts have the character of recipes. And I think this has many, many consequences, even for the neo-avant-garde. The fact that many of these works don't have a claim for their singularity. They have the character of recipes, and the results of those recipes are exemplifications of a practice, which means there is a dissolution between producer and recipient because the recipient himself could make those things. You just have to have access to the recipes in a certain sense. And there's a suspension of this special singular character of the work here, which is important here for this suspension of the antithesis between producer and recipient. I think this is really, really important. And you can see that same impulse in many other spheres. I was talking about the cultural industry. Usually critical theory will treat the cultural industry as one monolithic thing, but what is interesting is to see within the cultural industry itself the avant-gardist movement. For instance, I tend to defend, for instance, punk rock or rap and some other forms of practice in this same sense, that they are kind of exemplifications of which you can take part in. Like, what is the suspension of competence in punk? Is it because you want to do like bad music? I don't think so. I think it's about exemplifying a form of practice that anyone can take part in. And therefore, it's also part of this avant-gardist negative impulse that traverse the avant-garde up to even be existing within the cultural industry of the rock and roll production system, something like that. So this is really, really important. For instance, my defense of punk comes from, in a certain sense, that kind of reception. And those here that knows a little bit of my musical production and knows my engagement with noise. Noise is exactly that. Noise music is something that you play in 1 week, next week your friends have their own bands. So it has like this weird kind of dissemination where you don't need to spend years acquiring a craft in order to engage in an activity. It also has like this recipe-like character. Like you could just immediately make it. And so there's not necessarily an emphasis on the singularity of the result presented so much as it is presented as an exemplification of a certain form of practice that is supposed to be universalized. So this is why I'm saying it's kind of important to know what the means are through which the avant-gardist impulse is expressed in practice. Otherwise, it becomes like this abstract dictum, no difference between art and life. Yeah, that doesn't mean much. But when you see it in practice, what are the techniques, what are the things that are done that push in that direction, it becomes more interesting, I think. Yeah, I think I'll stop here. What should we do? Clarice, you're there. Should we do presentation? I mean, introductions. Normally, at this point, everybody's still here.
We have 10 minutes to make the presentations.
Is it enough? I'm not sure. I don't know.
I don't know. Do you prefer to maintain the presentations to the next session or in that session?
We could do the next session, but I mean, okay, let us do the following. If anybody has a question, we can use the 10 last minutes to answer them. Otherwise, we could, 10 minutes will be, yeah, we're wasting time already. So yeah, we'll do that presentation next time. So any questions? Final essay assignment. Yeah, I already said that there's not much to discuss. It's just 10-page essay, up to 10 pages essay, because more than that would be a lot for me to read if everybody turns up an essay about any aspect of the seminar that you want to develop. So it's really very open-ended. Is that clear? Okay, Rob and Clara. Rob first, I think.
Hi, JP. Thank you for that lecture. That was really...
I'll send the slide. Sorry, I'm just answering very quickly this chat. I will send the
Yeah,
slide after the session. Sorry. Go on, Rob.
Yeah, I was just wondering, I started to read a little bit of Henry Flint this week, actually, Ruminous Spirituality. And I was just wondering if you could...
Yeah, this is late Flint. It's a bit different. Go on.
Yeah. So I was actually wondering if you could send a link to the text that you were referencing earlier in the class. I think you were talking about concept art.
Yeah. Of course.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of text, interesting text. There's the concept art essay itself. And there's one called Studies in Constitutive Dissociation, which is important to me. And there's my own text about Flint, which was published in eFlux 3 years back. Constitutive dissociations as a means of world unmaking. So it's all about these things that I was talking about. Okay, I can send you all that material. Anything else?
That would be great. Thank you. That was all. Thanks.
Okay. Clara.
Thank you. That was very interesting. I think I'm still trying to wrap my brain around how the autonomy of art both is like a condition for its effectiveness, but then it also is like a limitation to the effectiveness of its critique. And I think the example of Duchamp, to me at least, I mean, I was wondering if maybe you could expand a little bit on that, because he adopts and subverts conventions of the art apparatus, right? Like his urinal was like fountain or whatever is used in a context where like he's submitting it anonymously into what is supposed to be a presentation of anything could be art, and he adopts certain conventions like a podium, signing, dating, and of course it's not his right name. But I guess if I'm wondering if you can talk through a little bit more how this tension of, if you can say more about that essentially.
Yeah, I think the background question is the fact that the autonomization is condition and it's also obstacle. This was the background question, right? Yeah. The thing is it's the autonomization is the condition of criticism in the sense that if you don't have the autonomization, you don't have the universal to be criticized. So if you don't have autonomization, you don't even have art as art. You have specific kinds of art. And the difference that I was making between criticism and self-criticism is the difference between one form of art being against another form of art within art, and the system of art itself being self-critical of itself, which entails that you're taking distance from the singular thesis presented by each form of art. You're not only dealing with forms of art anymore. My form of art is better than your form of art. No, you are dealing with art, as an universal that encompasses all of these different styles, as he says, or artistic means, something like that. Why is it an obstacle also? Well, there are two moments. The first moment, that is the virtuous moment of self-conscious of art, self-consciousness, would be aestheticism. It's the moment where, okay, we now define art as art because art is our religion, so to speak. L'art pour l'art, art for art's sake. We're not doing art for anything else. We're not doing it for religion, not doing for the king. We're doing art for art's sake. And there is an ideology to that. If you remember Oscar Wilde, there's art is almost a form of life already in aestheticism, in a certain sense. So there you have like a certain social sphere in the sense of a set of activities that embody this experience, the aesthetic experience. And the idea of it being an obstacle also means that, yes, there is this constitution of this form of life, so to speak, artistic form of life, which was characteristic of a bohemian class. But it's reserved. It's reserved to that kind of activity. This is what the obstacle part is. So when the avant-garde comes, the thesis here is that the avant-garde would try to find the means through which this form of existence that is exclusive to the sphere of activities that is individualized by art in its moment of self-consciousness, that this could be not enclosed anymore. This could be sublated into a different social form where these impulses are there, distributed in the form of life, not as an enclosed form of activity. One of the easiest way to see this is contemporarily the idea of free time. What do you do with free time? Yeah, with free time, you engage in artistic activities or fruition of art, or art in an expanded sense, if you want to say that, I don't know, Netflix series are art, I don't know. But anyway, maybe it's not an adequate concept for that. But anyway, a certain form of fruition of things that have as function their own fruition. So there's a certain autonomy there of the activity. You are not doing it to make money. You're not doing it to survive. You're doing it because, I don't know, you like it, you need it, or something like that. So this is kind of the easiest way to understand this enclosure. So this is kind of usually reserved for your free time, and your labor time is the time you're engaging in your own survival or something like that. And the idea here, critical theory idea, is that administrated societies like all over the place. So the one place where these aesthetic, so to speak, quality of life exists is not distributed in life anymore. It's just in a certain set of activities that you engage in your free time. And the way free time is mobilized by the system is exactly to make you able to come back to labor the day after. There's a very good, maybe it's my favorite Adorno essay, which is called Free Time. It's very funny, actually. I'm not really an Adornian, even though I think I'm more Adornian than most Adornians in the practical sense. But this essay is a killer essay, really. It's really fantastic. About the Duchamp gesture, I'm not sure what the crux of the question was. I think what Bürger the use of that Bürger makes of it, I think this will become clear once we get to once we get to fourth chapter, because he will be talking about the avant-garde work there. So what is the kind of work that is done by the avant-garde? So there is much more to be said there. He just wanted to make plausible the idea that the avant-garde, so let us call it still an artwork, even if that is not maybe completely adequate, is not the production of an individual genius anymore. He just took like serialized, industrialized objects and signed them, and so the mode of production is not the self-expression of an individual genius the way it was in bourgeois art. So, but you could have other examples. There's a theorist that's a very brilliant architect. Maybe you can find some stuff in English. Sérgio Ferro here from Brazil. They have like this project translating Ferro that's done in both in the UK and the University of São Paulo. And he has other examples. He has a very incredible book called Plastic Arts and Free Labor, 2 volumes. I wished I could give a seminar about this book soon, but we don't have a translation. And his example is Picasso and Braque's the way how can I translate this notion? The way the the workshop is shown. There's a workshop character to the collage phase of Braque and Picasso, where also it's a collage of also industrialized piece of paper, interventions of any kind, and everything like that. And he's proposing that that's an exemplification too. That's an exemplification, which is, I would say, exemplification is an important element of the avant-gardist work. But I'll have to develop that, because exemplification is also an important category of Nelson Goodman's aesthetics, and I would have to say what kind of exemplification is important in the avant-garde work, because exemplification is general to the artistic work for Nelson Goodman. But anyway, this is an aside. But it illustrates the workshop, and it's a workshop that is not done for any specific means. So the fact that you are exemplifying a certain space of freedom within manual labor. And Sérgio Ferro has this very strong thesis that the only form of manual labor where you are pursuing free time is plastic arts. Not intellectual work, manual labor. Plastic arts has an element of manual labor. So he's saying, yeah, you have this kind of manual labor that's very special here, that from the Renaissance was trying to distinguish itself from how to say that again? I'm missing the English now. From applied arts through specific techniques. He mentions, for instance, the non finito, like Michelangelo's non finito, which is like something that would be unacceptable in applied art, and it's only acceptable because there is a claim to that gesture, that it is an exception to what manual labor usually is achieving, right? So in a certain sense, the avant-garde has to do with this exemplificatory element of something that is not, first, is not the work of the individual genius, and it is an exemplification of something. It's not therefore collective, just the opposite is not just collective, but it has an exemplificatory character of something that is that is an exception to the means and rationality of manual labor usually. So I think the Duchamp example kind of satisfies all the criteria that I'm proposing, that I'm here I'm proposing because I brought Sergio Ferro in, but something like that. So this is why I think he's mentioning Duchamp, right? Like it's a determinate negation of the individual expression that is part and parcel of the bourgeois form of art in a certain sense. Of course, you could say that, I don't know, the big glass, what is it called? The La mariée mise à nu par ses célibataires, man. Yeah, there's much more like elaboration in there, but you also could argue it's not expressive in any sense. But yeah, I think to have much more to say about the specifics of the avant-garde artwork in the third session. I think maybe that will become clearer. Okay. Neve?
Thanks, JP. I hope we have time. I just have a kind of question more about text on Marcuse. Is that okay to ask that here, because we didn't really go into him that much, but he just seems to be sort of standing outside a little bit, or I was really kind of curious about his whole thesis on affirmative culture and his kind of critique of that, and where he's kind of talking about this sort of spiritualization of like the interiority, and I don't know, the way I kind of read it was I connected it with Marx's reading of Feuerbach, and where Marx sees in sort of religion a kind of the false ideology, like of but what's there is the kind of pure sensuous sort of feeling, and then the kind of the projection of the relation to a godhead, but then that actually Feuerbach says that's just as you said, the kind of like the product of his internal relationship in the human itself, and then Marx is kind of using that and exposing that as a kind of an ideology, and sort of turning it back on itself, or using it to turn Hegel back on himself. But so anyway, just the whole thing of the sensuous, like Marcuse has a really interesting relationship with the polarity between the sensuousness and rationality, and that uneven kind of relation, or that antagonism, which is always in through the history of philosophy more about rationality. And then of course what's escaping rationality in the aesthetic, but then actually it's just then he kind of goes in this direction about affirmative culture and its spiritualization, which seems to be really kind of, you could really apply it to our current day sort of wellness, like the rash of wellness in the in sort of neoliberal sort of culture, and the sort of human capital and human entrepreneur, and everybody's an artist, and I don't know if I'm really making a point there, but
I think super contemporary. I think the Marcuse essay is very, very contemporary, I think. I think there's a bunch of things there. First, the emphasis on sensuousness. I have a complicated relationship to that thesis, because there is a byproduct of critical theory sometimes, that is the indictment of formal sciences and math and this kind of thing, that I think it's unsavory, I think. So as much as I on board with the avant-gardist impulse and the idea of maybe the atrophy of experience that comes from the specialization of different social spheres, so you are just doing one thing at each time of the day, which is very Marcusean also thesis, the atrophy of experience. Sometimes it seems to me then that the fullness of experience to be regained is a little bit of a fantasy sometimes.
Yeah.
It's not so much about the fullness of experience itself. It's more about the exclusiveness of certain forms of experience. For me, this is the way that I take the kind of the cash value, the good thing that I take from this and the avant-gardist impulse is like a critique of exclusiveness of certain forms of association and behavior and the pleasure you can take out of it, more than a supposed fullness of experience that is completely refracted through the specialized social spheres that we live in. Because actually, I don't really think that you can, rationally really defend that there is like some sensuousness that completely evades rationalization. Everything can be rationalized at some point. You could, assign degrees of intensity, or you could, you could formalize. I mean, I can't really defend. This is one of the most polemical things that I actually believe, but I can't really defend it. Some Marxists would say that materialism has to defend the extra-logical, this is Lucio Coletti, the extra-logical character of material reality. I don't think that's true. I think there's nothing out of logic. But the thing is, you don't know which logic. This is the problem. And so you have an epistemic problem when you're dealing with reality, that you don't really know, you don't really have the key to opening the black boxes. So it's an epistemic problem, and for me, it's kind of also more. It's also more fascinating that way, that we have like a bunch of ultra complex logical objects, and we live amongst them, and we just don't know. We just don't know what their rationality really is. But that doesn't mean that they are not rational. And this is a Hegelian insight that I retain, that to be is to be in a certain way, like so. What is the way it is, So in a certain sense, I have a little bit of a problem with Feuerbachian materialism in that sense, where it pits sensuality against rationality. I don't think it is against rationality. I just think it's a different form of rationality, perhaps. And I wouldn't define the social sphere of art, the aesthetic experience as a claim to sensuality that is nowhere else. I wouldn't say that. I would say it's a claim to a certain use of rationality. Sensuality, yes, but also rationality. And it's a use of rationality for its own sake sometimes. One of the greatest pleasure that we derive from engaging in art making is to understand its immanent logic. I'm a musician also, so one of the things that got me into music was the fact that I didn't understand what was listening. It wasn't immediate. I didn't go to music because I listened to pop. I go to music because I listened to Schoenberg when I was a teenager, and I said, what the fuck is that? And I was fascinated enough to want to understand how is it done, and what are those relationships that are embedded in that sensuousness, which is the most interesting thing, to be rational and sensuous at the same time. So this is also my version of maybe the critique that the avant-garde is making. Why is it that maybe these dimensions are separated where they ought to be together? It's not a claim to sensuousness, it's a claim to rational sensuousness, so to speak, because we don't use reason sensuousnessly enough, perhaps. And art has this interesting claim of using reason in a sensual manner. So it's something like that instead of what Marcuse actually says. But nevertheless, it is also super contemporary when you see like well-being, the well-being industry, this kind of thing.
No. That's really interesting, because it just depends on what the emphasis is put on there. Because with Marcuse, he ends up actually going into the importance of Hegel and mind, and a sort of absoluteness of mind rather than sort of spirit, and it's just that he introduces it in relation to the whole kind of dialectical problem of the sensuous and the rational. That's kind of why I've kind of put it out there, but also because in one of the early the Bürger text, there's just one piece actually here going back to Kant and this idea of the complete determination, and this idea of the the full unfolding of the constituent elements of a field is the condition for the possibility of an adequate cognition of that field. And in bourgeois society, only with aestheticism that the full unfolding of the phenomenon of art became a fact. And it is to aestheticism that the historical avant-garde movements respond. And one part I just want to read this out: active cognition is not transferred to reality itself, that the subject that produces the insight is negated, rather that the possibilities of cognition are limited by the real historical unfolding of the object. But here we're just in Hegel territory, aren't we? The real historical unfolding of the object and mind, in a way. That seems to me. So this was where I'm just trying to set those two things against each other a little bit, philosophy of mind, philosophy of spirit there.
Yeah, I would ask you to wait to the third or fourth section, because I have a take on that in the discussion with Martin, also in the convex portrait paper, of this specific dialectic between the category that is gestated, generated in social practice, and the category that is spiritualized as a theoretical object, which was also my problem with Althusser, the cut between the theoretical and the real object in a certain sense. But yeah, I would have more to say, I think, by then.
Okay. Yeah. No. Thank you. I missed what you said there. You froze, but that's okay.
Oh, I froze. Sorry.
Well, I don't know whether it was my connection, but or you, but yeah.
Do you want me to repeat? I don't remember.
No, it's okay. Don't worry. Yeah.
There is one little question about Andy Warhol. I think, can I ask you to make the question next time again? How does Andy Warhol fit within this critique? Would his practice also be considered as an exemplification? Yeah, definitely is an exemplification. But in the Goodman sense, definitely is an exemplification. We can talk about exemplification at some point, because it just emerged. I didn't plan to talk about Goodman, but at some point, maybe if we keep talking about it, I'll have to explain exemplification. But please,
you can send the questions in Discord, in the Discord channel.
Yeah, that's a good point. I almost forgot. There is the Discord channel. I always urge you to use the Discord channel, because I actually look there and I actually answer, and sometimes there are huge answers with lots of messages. So
yeah,
I do take my time to answer the Discord, but people apparently don't want to use it. But yeah, if you have a question like this, I'll be glad to answer also during the week on Discord.
Yeah, I will end the recording.
Okay. Thank you.